Two people descend a snow-covered pass with the distant silhouette of Mount Oder 10 on the horizon. This is the northern Urals. An unpleasant wind, dark clouds, and cold create a bleak atmosphere. February here is truly harsh. Two students from the Ural Polytechnic are in the mountains, searching for their friends. About 10 days ago, searchers stumbled upon a dark spot in the snow, which turned out to be the tent of the missing group. Inside, they found no one, only abandoned belongings. The students began calling for their friends, hoping they were nearby, but their cries went unanswered. Soon, they will come across the bodies of 9 frozen members of the Dyatlov hiking group. The deceased will be found with unusual injuries, and some will have missing eyes and tongues. Many of the victims will be almost without clothing, which raises questions considering the winter conditions of the expedition. Mystical slashes will also be found on the tent. Why did 9 young and healthy people panic and leave their tent at night, rapidly descending the mountain slope almost without clothing and footwear? What happened to the Dyatlov Group? The mystery of the Dyatlov Pass possesses a unique quality, representing an ideal myth. On one hand, there is enough information about the incident. There are documents, photographs, and testimonies from relatives and witnesses. At the same time, the mystery surrounding the death of the Dyatlov Group lacks key elements. Even the official conclusions of the investigation appear ambiguous. The inquiry concluded that the cause of the tragedy was a natural force that the tourists could not withstand. What happened? What force could they not overcome? It is no surprise that there are numerous alternative theories, from foreign spies to escaped criminals, from secret tests of Soviet military equipment to the crash of an American plane, from local tribes to wild animals, from an avalanche to mass hallucinations, as well as the effects of radiation or even UFOs. It remains to be determined which of these versions is the most plausible. One of the rooms is already occupied, and people are hurriedly packing backpacks with food, gear, and medical supplies, everything necessary for a challenging trek in the Urals. The group leader, Igor Dyatlov, is closely watching the packing process. He is 23 years old, tall, strong, and self-assured. According to the experienced guide, everyone wanted to join him on this expedition. Although many wanted to go on hikes under his leadership, not everyone had the opportunity. At the same time, some tourists who knew Dyatlov noted that he could be excessively strict and demanding with his team. Certainly, Igor had a high level of qualification. By the start of the expedition in 1959, he had numerous trips under his belt, including leading many of them. Dyatlov, the son of engineers and a student of the radio engineering faculty, despite the ban on homemade VHF radios, built such a device himself and used it on several previous journeys. According to the plan, the tourists were to cover more than 300 kilometers in just over 2 weeks. Considering the food supplies for the challenging expedition, the heavy radio receiver did not seem like an obvious choice, although it could have potentially saved the team's lives. In the dormitory room are 2 students from the Ural Polytechnic, Zenaida Kolmogorova and Lyudmila Dubinina. The 20-year-old Dubinina is the youngest in the team. Nevertheless, Both girls have already participated in several expeditions. Despite his fragile health and ongoing issues with his back and knees, Yudin had participated in hikes multiple times, believing that they, on the contrary, contributed to improving his well-being. Yuri needed to strengthen his health. However, it was his ailment that would force him to leave the route almost immediately, which ultimately would save his life. Yuri Krivonyshenko is the main joker and musician of the group, a recent graduate of the Ural Polytechnic, currently working as a foreman at a construction site in the closed city of Chelyabinsk. Alexander Kolovatov is a 20-year-old student of the Polytechnic, the oldest among those gathered in the dormitory room. He was responsible, yet at the same time a quiet and reserved young man. One of his mysterious traits was that he kept a diary, which he carefully hid from his friends. In addition, he smoked an antique pipe. Rustam Slobodin can be considered a key figure in the Dyatlov Group. He was the son of a professor, which in Soviet times was associated with prestige and affluence. Finally, the ninth person in the dormitory room is Nikolai Tiba-Brignol, a scientist who graduated from the Polytechnic a year ago. He was working as an engineer at that time. After the preparations are completed, all 9 individuals head to the train station, where the 10th participant joins them. Among the participants, Semyon Zolotaryov stands out in particular. He is not only an experienced tourist, but also an instructor at a tourist base in the Sverdlovsk region. Semyon initially planned to participate in the expedition with another group, but due to personal circumstances, he was unable to do so and requested to join the Dyatlov Group. He was accepted as his experience would be beneficial to the team. Zolotaryov is undoubtedly the most enigmatic member of the group. Authors of various theories regarding the tragedy of the expedition often perceive him as a central figure. We will discuss the reasons for this later. For now, let us note his impressive mustache and the fact that he prefers to go by the name Sasha, while having a tattoo with the name Gina. Zolotaryov has other tattoos as well. In the Soviet Union of that time, tattoos were considered quite rare, but for war participants, they were a common occurrence. We will return to the biographies and personalities of the participants more than once. At the stage of the investigation, many of the mentioned details may seem insignificant, but over time they will take on unexpected meaning. What can be asserted at this stage is that all the participants of the expedition, despite their age, are experienced tourists. Their qualification for a third-category hike speaks for itself. Considering Dyatlov's reputation, one can draw conclusions about the psychological state of the participants. Many of them will keep journals during the expedition, especially if assistance is needed for a fellow member. The group has several cameras intended for reports to the sports club. However, the Dyatlov Group also actively documents the everyday events of the hike. The film found later may provide important information about the course of the expedition and the possible reasons for their tragic demise. It is appropriate to add some historical context for a better understanding of the situation. It is likely that this video is being watched by those who have never lived in the USSR. By the late 1950s, the members of the Dyatlov Group were far from being the only tourism enthusiasts. During that period, the tourism movement was experiencing its peak, which became an important feature of the thaw era. Hikes, tents, guitars, and bard songs created an atmosphere of relative freedom for several generations of Soviet people. The Dyatlov Group was not the only tourist team in their institute. The Ural Polytechnic Institute, by the way, is among the best universities in the country, which also highlights the caliber of the expedition participants. Entries in journals and testimonies from acquaintances confirm that they were intelligent, multifaceted, and creative young people. Despite their technical education, they wrote poetry and songs, were passionate about photography, and of course, loved to travel. On January 26, 1959, the group departed from Sverdlovsk and reached the settlement of the 41st quarter a few days later, located near Ivdel. In a sense, this marks the end of the civilized world. The region was home to many people with criminal backgrounds or who served as guards for former prisoners. The last few days of travel, when the group primarily traveled by trains and buses, passed peacefully, surrounded by songs and conversations. However, a few incidents are worth noting. In the city of Serov, the tourists were not allowed to spend the night at the station, and Yuri Krivonashenko, the most active member of the team, put on a little show. He found a hat, began to ask for alms, and started singing a song, but ultimately he was detained at the local police station. The next incident with the police occurred while on the train from Serov, when a drunken man began to harass the group. These incidents did not lead to serious consequences for the Dyatlov Group. They had confirmation for their business trip, and the hike itself formally coincided with another Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which likely helped resolve the situations with the police. These episodes are significant for at least one of the prevalent theories regarding the causes of the tragedy. On January 27th, the group reached their destination. However, Yuri began to experience pain in his legs and back. A few days prior, he had hoped that the discomfort would subside. However, by January 28th, it became clear that he would not be able to continue. While the 9 members of the Dyatlov Group continued along the Laz River, Yuri decided to return to the settlement of the 41st quarter. This moment is crucial for the investigation. Everything that will happen to the group later cannot be reconstructed. According to outside witnesses, the Dyatlov Group would not encounter anyone on their way, at least no one who could report such an encounter. According to their plan, they intended to make a crossing through the northern Urals and reach Mount Otorten, and then head back to arrive in the settlement of Vijay by February 12th and send a telegram about their successful arrival at the Institute. The Dyatlov Group encountered other expeditions along their way, who warned them about heavy snowfall in the region. Thus, the group leader's assumption about changing the timeline seems justified. By mid-February, most students from the Polytechnic Institute returned to their studies, including those who went on hikes during the break. However, on February 16th, hardly anyone among the students and sports club members expresses concern about the Dyatlov Group. Delays in hikes, especially in winter, are not uncommon, even in Uba. Yuri Yudin does not raise the alarm. Perhaps he feels a slight sense of guilt that holds him back. For several days, they continuously call the head of the sports club and representatives of the Polytechnic Institute with inquiries. However, they only received standard statements about the group's delay and a refusal to send a plane for the search. In response, they are informed that the group has not returned. The official search operation only begins on February 20th. The first difficulty for the search participants is the lack of the Dyatlov Group's route. Each team was required to provide a plan for their hike, but the Dyatlov Group did not have one. Ultimately, the route was reconstructed by chance. Several members of the group managed to share details of their upcoming route with friends, which ultimately helped create a plan for the search operation. An AN-2 aircraft takes off along the presumed route of the Dyatlov Group. The searchers hope to spot either the tourists themselves or traces of their presence from the air. Representatives of the Institute Sports Club fly by helicopter to the location where the group stopped, as well as to small Mansi settlements, of which there are only a few thousand in this region. In one of the settlements, the local leader reports that the group of tourists visited them a couple of weeks ago. Their stay was brief. They had tea, but did not stay overnight and continued their journey. The first days of the search yield no results. Despite the constant efforts of ground teams, traces of the Dyatlov Group cannot be found. As a result, the military joins the search, including dog handlers with dogs, as well as some of the most experienced tourists from the region and the Union. Representatives of the local Mansi people, familiar with the territory, also participate in the search. At this stage, nearly 10 days after the Dyatlov Group arrived in the village of Vizhai, almost no one takes the possibility of a tragedy seriously, even when sending telegrams. Yes, a criminal case has already been opened regarding the disappearance of the group, and a local prosecutor has been appointed to handle the proceedings. However, this feels more like a formality. Yevgeny Maslenikov, one of the leading tourism specialists in the Sverdlovsk region and a participant in the search, believes that although the Dyatlov route is challenging, the group is experienced and well prepared, so they should be able to successfully cope with the challenges. The searchers decide to position the group of tourists on Mount Otorten, which was the final destination of the Dyatlov Group's route. The tourists had planned to leave a cache there with a note. Therefore, it makes sense to check whether the Dyatlov Group reached Otorten in order to then continue following their trail. Slabtsova plays a key role in this story, representing one of the most well-known versions of the Dyatlov Group's demise. Ground searchers communicate with aerial search teams using signals. The hikers form specific shapes with their bodies, thereby conveying the results of their actions to those in the aircraft on February 25th. The first success for Slabtsova's group comes with the discovery of a barely noticeable ski track that could belong to the Dyatlov Group. This occurs in the valley of the Auspia River. To determine which direction the Dyatlov Group was headed, they decide to split up and follow the track in different directions. Slabtsov and his team find a tourist campsite, likely belonging to the missing group, but they are unable to determine exactly when it was set up. His heart races with excitement. Slabtsov confidently identifies this tent as belonging to the Dyatlov Group. Nearby, several skis are stuck in the snow, an ice axe is sticking out by the entrance, and a Dyatlov storm jacket lies not far away. Part of the tent is covered by a layer of snow about 20 centimeters thick. The appearance suggests that this was not caused by an avalanche, but rather resulted from snow being blown in by the wind. At the entrance of the tent, which is unzipped from the inside, the searchers discover that there are neither living nor dead members of the Dyatlov Group inside. This brings a sense of relief. There remains hope that their companions are still alive. The encouraging news about the found tent quickly reaches the other search teams, and the next day, several of them head to the site to continue the search for the missing. It should be noted that the prosecutor assigned to the investigation has not yet arrived at the tent. The tourists are examining it and the surrounding area on their own, acting rather chaotically. We already realize that the tent is an important piece of evidence and a potential crime scene. So there is a possibility that critical details may have been lost, overlooked, or even accidentally destroyed by the search participants. A striking manifestation of the haphazard examination is the numerous cuts on the wall of the tent facing down the slope. At first, no one pays proper attention to this, and later, the searchers will be unable to recall who first noticed them. During a quick inspection inside the tent, they find cameras, a flask of alcohol, a box containing documents, and money. Outside, a working flashlight lies on the tent. The discovery of alcohol and money is another encouraging fact, as it suggests that an attack by criminals is unlikely. One of the most significant finds is the group's diary, with the last entry dated January 31st. It indicates that the tourists left the Autopsy River Valley and planned to reach Mount Autopsy in 2 days. Before this, they decided to create a labaz, a storage for food and excess gear, so they could ascend lightly and then return the items afterward. After inspecting the tent, the searchers split into groups for further searches. About 20 meters down the slope, one of the teams discovers tracks. Some of them are large, while others are significantly smaller, indicating that they were left by people without shoes. 9 pairs of tracks stretch for about half a kilometer towards the valley of the Loza River. Initially, they move together, then separate into 2 parallel lines, and later reconnect before getting lost under the freshly fallen snow. At the same time, 1.5 kilometers from the tent, in the valley of the Loza River, another group of searchers is surveying the area to set up a camp. Not far from a stream, near a tall cedar tree, they discovered traces of a campfire. Overall, this location seems unappealing for starting a fire. While setting up a camp at an altitude of about 10 meters, the searchers noticed something unusual protruding from under the snow. Upon closer inspection, it turns out to be a human knee. Thus, the first 2 bodies of the Dyatlov Group were found. The searchers suspect that other bodies may be nearby, but instead, they come across cut stumps of young cedars. Most likely, the trees were felled for starting a fire. However, a question arises. Why then is there so much dead wood nearby that would have been much easier to use? Other searchers arrive at the site of the discovery to retrieve the found bodies. These turn out to be the bodies of Doroshenko and Krivonishenko. Neither of the victims is wearing jackets or pants. Only one has a checkered shirt and long underwear, which are also heavily worn. The faces show injuries resembling marks from bird beaks or animal claws. Beneath one of the bodies lie broken branches from a cedar tree. Meanwhile, the prosecutor and police representatives with dogs arrive at the scene. This man is dressed warmer than the members of the group who were found earlier. He is wearing a sweater, a vest, and pants. But he is also without a hat, gloves, and proper footwear, only wearing mismatched socks. When the searchers clear the snow from his face, many immediately recognize him. For the group leader, Igor Dyatlov, events that day unfold rapidly. A few hundred meters away, a dog finds another frozen body. It is a woman who, unlike the other victims, is dressed relatively warmly. She has a jacket, a hat and pants, but no shoes. She's only wearing socks on her feet. The woman's face is covered in traces of blood. Considering the found bodies, experienced tourist Yevgeny Maslenikov puts forward the first version of events. He suggests that a storm could have been the cause of the deaths, blowing the members of the Dyatlov Group down the slope. Maslenikov sends a telegram to his colleagues and receives a logical question. If the wind was indeed strong enough to carry people away, then why did the tent and its contents remain in place? In light of recent events, it has been decided to replace the local prosecutor with a more experienced one. Starting March 1st, Lev Ivanov takes over the case, becoming an important figure in the investigation of the Dyatlov Group's deaths. Ivanov travels to the scene of the tragedy, where his main task is to assess the situation and find the remaining members of the group. The capabilities of the dogs are not limitless. For example, these animals are ineffective for finding bodies buried deep in the snow. Therefore, the searchers continue to inspect the slope of the mountain, using long probes to pierce the snow. This work is very labor-intensive and requires great caution, as bodies may be hidden beneath the snow. These attempts yield no results, and the searchers with metal detectors prove to be just as ineffective as the dogs when it comes to searching beneath a thick layer of snow. Upon arrival, Lev Ivanov carefully examines the condition of the Dyatlov Group's tent. After inspecting it, following the visit of non-specialist tourists, he concludes that the location chosen for the setup was unfortunate due to strong winds. However, the tent is still standing securely. In one of his first radiograms, Ivanov proposes the hypothesis of a storm wind as a possible initial cause of the tragedy, based on the fact that traces of dinner preparation were found in the tent, as well as nearly all the outer clothing. There are also traces of human urine near the tent. While one group was lighting a temporary fire by the cedar, another attempted to return to the tent, but froze along the way. The remaining group soon faced the same fate, as they had neither clothing nor food. However, this does not explain why the tent remained in place. But how then can the cuts on one side of the tent, along with all the belongings, be explained? Moreover, the hypothesis of a storm wind will not be confirmed during the further investigation. Despite the shortcomings of this preliminary conclusion, there are logical points in this theory. The fact that the bodies were mostly found without clothing may indicate that the tourists faced a threat at the moment of changing clothes. This threat was so serious and prolonged that it prompted the travelers to descend down the slope into the valley of the Lozva River. Tourism expert Maslenikov soon presents a new version of events. He suggests that the threat in question could have been a phenomenon described by witnesses as a fireball, which was allegedly observed in this region on February 1st and 17. In the second case, it was a tourist group led by Karelin. The participants reported that early in the morning on February 17th, they were awakened by the shouts of their companions who were preparing breakfast outside. The tourists emerged from the tent, mostly without clothing, and noticed a huge glowing sphere in the sky that was gradually increasing in size. One of the tourists stated that it was something more than a meteorite, and it seemed as if it was about to fall to the ground. Ultimately, the group watched as the sphere moved across the sky for a minute before disappearing. The last entry in the diary for January 31st notes reports that such a sphere was observed not only on February 17th, but also on February 1st. Another interesting fact related to Karelin's group is that shortly before the incident with the fireball, they made a stop for tea in one of the villages with the Mansi people. The head of this village later informed Dyatlov searchers that tourists had stopped with him, but in reality, Dyatlov and the Central Committee of the Mansi did not visit. He simply confused them with Karelin's group. Representatives of the indigenous people played a significant role in the story of the disappearance of the tourists from Ural Polytechnic. One version suggests that they may have been responsible for the tragedy. Perhaps the students offended someone from the Mansi or desecrated a site sacred to them, which led to the attack and the deaths of the tourists. We will return to this theory later. For now, it is worth noting that the search group for Dyatlov included representatives of the indigenous population who helped find the Dyatlov Group's labaz on March 2nd. Unfortunately, it does not contain important information except that its contents appear to be untouched. 3 days later, about a kilometer from the tent, the body of Rustem Bodan was found, who was dressed quite warmly. As for the other items, Bodan was wearing a shirt, a sweater, long johns, and pants. On one foot was a felt boot, and on his head was a ski cap. This last detail again raises doubts about the version of the storm wind. How could the cap have remained in place? Slobodin was found lying face down, with a small depression in the snow beneath his face, indicating that he was still breathing when he fell to the ground. However, the most curious detail is the mark on his head, suggesting a possible severe blow from a blunt object. At the same time, the results of the tent examination regarding the strange cuts were received. On one side of the tent, the cuts were made by the searchers on the first day of its discovery. However, numerous small damages on the other side were not made by them. Further examination of the cuts on the tent confirms that they were made with a knife, and importantly, the cuts were made from the inside rather than the outside. This suggests that the Dyatlov Group may have urgently attempted to leave the tent for some reason without the opportunity to calmly unzip it at the exit. At the same time, the results of the medical examination are ready, indicating that the deaths of all 5 found tourists were due to hypothermia. However, the main question regarding the causes of what happened and the whereabouts of the other 4 participants remains unanswered during the ongoing investigation. The relatives of the 5 found students are preparing for the funerals, and they are surprised by the authorities' persistent suggestion to hold the ceremonies in the mountains or an Ivdel, which seems very unusual considering that all the deceased lived and studied in Sverdlovsk. As a result of persistent protests from the relatives, they are finally allowed to hold the funerals in the city. Nevertheless, information about the missing group and the found bodies quickly spreads throughout Sverdlovsk. Many people come to say their final goodbyes to the group members, with some reports indicating more than 1,000 attendees. 4 of the 5 deceased are buried in the same cemetery in the city, while Yuri Krivonyshenko is buried in another. It was his father who became the source of testimony regarding the alleged fireball. On February 1st, 2 tourists from the Institute who attended the funeral told him that they had observed something similar, as did the members of the Karelin group, who mentioned an incident on February 17th. Information about the mysterious fireball recorded several times in February reaches prosecutor Ivanov. The coincidence of testimonies from several independent sources lends weight to this information, ruling out the possibility of it being attributed to fabrication or error. Additionally, Ivanov has ready photographs taken by hired cameras of the group shortly before the tragedy. The searchers found 3 cameras in the tent. After developing the film, the investigators saw familiar scenes from the expedition in the photographs: nature, interactions among the tourists, skiing excursions, and breaks. However, as they approached the end of the film, it became increasingly difficult to look at these images, not because of their content, but due to the realization that the people in the photographs were heading towards their own demise. However, the last photograph from Krivonyshenko's camera film caught the investigators' attention for a different reason. It is a dark shot with a blurred bright light. This brings to mind the stories about the fireball. We will discuss the reasons for this later. While investigator Ivanov continues the investigation, searchers attempt to find the bodies of the remaining 4 tourists in the area of the tent. March and April pass without results. Only at the beginning of May, as the snow begins to melt, does an unexpected discovery occur. First, small broken branches of fir and cedar appear, which are not scattered randomly, but seem to form something resembling a path leading to danger. One of the Mansi hunters makes his discovery. Walking along the path by the ravine, he comes across a frozen pant leg, which looks as if it has been roughly cut. The arriving searchers find a piece of a sweater nearby, and later that same day, they discover a body. It will later be established that this is Lyudmila Dubinina. During further excavations, 3 more male bodies are found nearby. They are positioned close to each other, as if the friends were trying to warm themselves in their final moments. These are Zolotaryov, Kolevatov, and Tiba Brignol. The bodies show signs of decomposition associated with partial contact with water. However, even this does not explain why some of the bodies are missing their eyeballs and why Dubinina is missing her tongue. The most intriguing aspect regarding the 4 discovered bodies is revealed after the autopsy. In the cases of Lyudmila Dubinina, Zolotaryov, and Tiba Brignol, the cause of death was determined to be injuries caused by the impact of a great force. The first 2 exhibited multiple rib fractures, while Tiba had a fracture at the base of the skull. Thus, according to the expert conclusion, the deaths are classified as violent. It is unclear what exactly the term violent means. It could be caused by the forces of nature or by a person. However, this significantly complicates the investigation. Such injuries are unlikely to have resulted from a fall, as there were no large rocks or objects on the slope that the tourists could have struck. In May 1959, the funerals of the last members of the Dyatlov tourist group took place. The relatives of the deceased insisted on open caskets. However, at the direction of Prosecutor Ivanov, the ceremony was held with closed caskets. The prosecutor explained this by the significant decomposition of the bodies, adding that only Dubinina's father was allowed to see the body, after which he lost consciousness. The investigation was unable to find any obvious evidence to support any of the theories. There are numerous theories, and we will attempt to identify the true one among them. It is worth noting that over the course of half a century, an overwhelming number of theories have emerged. We cannot examine them all in detail, so we will focus on the main ones, where logic and motivation can be observed. All theories can be divided into 4 main groups based on the key facts, both indirect and direct. The first category consists of natural phenomena. It includes spontaneous occurrences, such as storms and avalanches. The criminal version includes Mansi hunters, escaped criminals, and other factors. There is also an anomalous version that links the events to UFOs, infrasound, and similar phenomena. As Sherlock Holmes noted, if you eliminate all the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. Let us apply this principle to the investigation of the Dyatlov Group's tragedy. One of the merits of this theory is that the authorities monitored the indigenous population significantly less strictly than ordinary citizens. The next possibility is that the students may have entered a sacred place for the indigenous people or encountered the Mansi, which led to a conflict and ultimately the demise of the Dyatlov Group. Currently, this version has few supporters and is unlikely to resonate. Even in 1959, it was quickly dismissed. By that time, the concept of sacred places among the Mansi had virtually disappeared. Moreover, the Mansi are a friendly people. Tourist groups have repeatedly stopped in their villages, and some members have assisted in the search for the Dyatlov Group. The avalanche theory appears to be a natural explanation for the situation. Most incidents involving tourists in the mountains around the world occur due to this, and avalanches are responsible for about 80% of fatalities. Thus, attributing everything to an avalanche would be quite logical. However, even the prosecution did not accept this version during the initial investigation. Firstly, the location of Mount Kolachakal and the angle of its slope significantly reduced the likelihood of an avalanche. For at least 60 years, there have been no recorded instances of avalanches in this area. After the incident with the Dyatlov Group, Prosecutor Ivanov, tourism expert Maslenikov, and other specialists noted that there were no signs of an avalanche at the scene. The tent was securely standing, and the ski poles next to it also remained in place. The layer of snow on the tent was quite minimal. Proponents of the avalanche theory explain the absence of signs of its occurrence by suggesting that the snow was blown away by the wind. This seems strange, as the tracks left by the Dyatlov Group during their descent also remained untouched. Furthermore, the injuries and causes of death among the expedition members vary. Hypothermia could justify the avalanche theory, but not all died from exposure. Sustaining injuries such as rib fractures and head trauma in Zolotova, Dubinina, and Blim from an avalanche would be quite difficult. This is not a typical avalanche. One of the main proponents of this theory is Boris Slabtsov, one of the search participants who discovered the tent. Supporters of the snow slab theory believe that the found bodies, their injuries, and the condition of the tourists' personal belongings support their viewpoint. At the same time, a snow slab is different from an avalanche. A snow slab slid down the slope. As a result, many of the bodies were missing clothing, and the rib and head fractures could have been caused by the fallen slab. The tourists attempted to cut their way out of the tent from the inside. Some of them sustained serious injuries, while the others, who were less severely affected, helped them escape and descend. The injured were left in a ravine and covered, which is why they had more clothing on them. The other tourists attempted to return to the tent, but lost their strength and died from hypothermia. A strong argument in favor of the snow slab theory is the presence of direct evidence. Many of the tourists indeed perished from freezing, which fits logically into the situation involving the slab's descent. The authors of this theory explain the absence of eyes and tongues in some of the victims as the result of animal activity. However, it does not account for a number of details, and the proposed explanations do not seem sufficiently convincing. As a result, the snow slab theory has not gained widespread acceptance. It has its supporters, but there are also many opponents. How could these tourists cover such a long distance of over a kilometer with serious injuries, even with the help of others? Judging by the number of tracks left behind, all members of the group descended successfully on their own, rather than being carried by their companions. How could the surviving members of the group construct a platform, start a fire, and perform other actions while being almost without clothing? It is important to remember that they likely did this at night. The third version suggests that a strong wind was the cause of the incident. Initially, this theory was considered by some researchers and the prosecutor, but further analysis renders it unlikely. While the wind can be strong, it is not sufficient to knock people down and cause them serious injuries, whereas hurricane-force winds would be nearly twice as powerful. Furthermore, even if we assume that one or several members of the group were swept away by the wind and the others rushed to their aid, it remains unclear why they did so with virtually no clothing or footwear. While the desire to save friends is understandable, the Dyatlov Group were experienced tourists and were not foolish individuals. It is unlikely that they would have acted in such a manner in such a challenging situation. Finally, the tent left at the site and the numerous items found there likely contradict the theory of strong winds. The fourth version concerns weapons, specifically fireballs. Prosecutor Lev Ivanov mentioned in a newspaper interview in 1990 that he was strongly urged to close the case and not pursue the theory of fireballs. Moreover, he expressed the opinion that these fireballs could have been the true cause of the Dyatlov Group's demise. On one hand, Ivanov's data presented in the newspaper 30 years after the tragedy should be approached with a certain degree of skepticism. He does not specify whether the spheres were a weapon or a rocket and describes this phenomenon rather vaguely as a mass of energy that modern science cannot explain. On the other hand, even basic knowledge of history allows us to understand the era in which the Dyatlov Group's tragedy occurred. It was the height of the Cold War and the space race, associated with the launch sites of Plesetsk and Baikonur. In Baikonur, rocket launches took place in February and March, which can be linked to the observations of fireballs recorded by the Karelin tourist group and other witnesses in the northern Ural region. It was during this period that such launches actually occurred. Among researchers of the tragedy, there are heated debates about whether rocket launches can be observed from certain launch sites. However, the main point is that there is no evidence that anyone saw fireballs specifically on February 1st, when the events involving the Dyatlov Group took place. There is an unclear story related to Kolovatov's father, who was allegedly informed about this by two tourists from the Institute. Meanwhile, the photograph from Krivonyshenko's camera, which captures a bright spot against a dark background, is most likely a random shot taken either by the tourist himself or found by one of the searchers. This spot in the center is an obvious glare, which can be confirmed by its octagonal shape. The wishes of high-ranking officials at that time to close the case and not delve into the theory of fireballs may have been influenced by connections to the rocket launches. Among the theories about what happened, there emerged a hypothesis regarding radiation exposure. According to this theory, the tourists may have encountered radiation caused by some kind of weapon. This theory arose in the spring of 1959, when Ivanov was conducting an investigation and interviewing experts in the field of tourism. One of them suggested that the strange behavior of the tourists could have been triggered by the influence of certain gases. On the clothing of some victims, particularly those found last in the ravine, an elevated level of radiation was recorded. However, this theory has its issues. Although the radiation levels in some of the tourists did indeed exceed normal readings, they were not high enough to cause serious harm. For that, the levels would have needed to be 50 or even 100 times higher. The presence of radiation on the clothing of the victims found by the stream can be explained, for example, by nuclear tests in Novaya Zemlya that same winter. The strange dark or orange tint to the skin that some witnesses described in the deceased may also be related to the fact that the bodies were exposed to the open sun for a time before being covered by snow. Ultraviolet exposure seems a more likely explanation compared to radiation. The radiation theory can also be supplemented by the hypothesis of infrasound, which could have been generated in the mountains due to air movement. However, the use of infrasound as a weapon has been abandoned by some states, as its effects proved to be extremely minimal and could not have caused such irrational behavior among the members of the expedition. The criminal version suggests that the members of the tourist group may have fallen victim to escaped convicts, former prisoners, or poachers. Additionally, nothing was missing from the tourists' tent or cache, neither money, nor alcohol, nor food. The conspiracy theory, presented as the sixth version, is one of the most complex. Its proponents claim that 2 members of the expedition were assisting the KGB and that the entire trip was used as part of an operation for controlled information transfer. Under the pretext of a student hike, KGB representatives were supposed to meet with foreign spies in the Ural Mountains and pass on secret data, including information about the Soviet nuclear program. The foreigners, believing that the information was genuinely valuable, actually became victims of disinformation orchestrated by the KGB. As a result of the meeting, something went wrong. Perhaps the foreigners began to suspect something amiss and decided to eliminate the tourists, acting professionally and leaving no traces. The initial plan was to take everyone out under the threat of weapons and leave them to freeze. Since this plan did not fully succeed, 3 participants had to resort to physical force, which explains the broken ribs, bruises, and the absence of a tongue in the victims. In support of this version, it can be noted that during the Cold War, foreign states were indeed actively engaged in espionage activities within the territory of the Soviet Union. Reconnaissance aircraft, probes were used, and agents were dropped. The main drawback of this version lies in the lack of direct evidence. All testimonies rely on indirect data available in the case. Proponents of the controlled information transfer theory argue that the absence of clear evidence of the murder of the Dyatlov Group indicates a high level of preparation on the part of the perpetrators, foreign spies. Nevertheless, the lack of evidence is more indicative of a shortage of facts than it is supportive of conspiracy theories. This version is a significant part of the myth surrounding Dyatlov, and most of its aspects are shrouded in mystery. Many continue to believe that the authorities are still hiding something. Nevertheless, nothing can definitively explain the reasons for the group's demise. When considering only the facts, such assumptions appear somewhat illogical. Later, during the Soviet Union era, the case was declassified. Since the beginning of perestroika and after the collapse of the USSR, many documents have been declassified, including those that are inconvenient for the authorities. Thus, Sherlock Holmes's method does not work in this situation. We have ruled out all unlikely versions, but in the end, nothing remains that could explain what happened. Against the backdrop of everything presented, the theory of a snow slab avalanche appears more plausible. Although it is not perfect and raises some questions, we have concrete facts found at the site of the tragedy that support this hypothesis. In contrast, other theories rely at best on circumstantial evidence. Likely, the main issue with the snow slab avalanche scenario lies in its insufficiently gripping nature, while the mystery of the Dyatlov Group remains alluring and intriguing. We possess a wealth of information, but not enough to provide a definitive answer. In this case, the very process of seeking the answer is much more captivating than the outcome, regardless of what it may be.